The autumn wind carried a sharp bite as Benjamin Scott laced up his hiking boots in the gravel parking lot of Devil's Backbone Trail. October 15th, 2003, had dawned crisp and clear in the Colorado Rockies, the kind of morning that made the 3-hour drive from Denver feel worthwhile. At 34, Benjamin was an experienced hiker who knew these mountains well, but today's solo expedition carried extra weight. His marriage to Marie was strained. Work pressures were mounting at the software company where he managed development teams, and he desperately needed the mental clarity that only wilderness solitude could provide. Marie had watched him pack that morning from their kitchen window, her nursing scrubs already laid out for her afternoon shift at Denver General. They'd argued the night before about his increasing tendency to disappear into the mountains alone, about the growing emotional distance between them after 5 years of marriage. She'd wanted to say something as he loaded his red North Face jacket and daypack into the Ford Explorer, some word that might bridge the gap that seemed to widen each week. Instead, she'd let him leave in silence, their last conversation still echoing with harsh words about forgotten dinner plans and unmet expectations. If you're watching this story unfold, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Now, let's continue following Benjamin's final day. The trailhead bustled with early morning activity as Benjamin signed the mandatory register at 9:30 a.m. His neat engineer's handwriting recorded his planned route along the main ridge trail and back, with an estimated return time of 4 p.m. Tom Rodriguez, the weathered ranger manning the information booth, later remembered the polite but distracted hiker who seemed to have something heavy on his mind. Rodriguez had mentioned the afternoon weather forecast, calling for possible snow at higher elevations, but Benjamin had nodded confidently and patted his jacket pocket where he kept emergency supplies. The first miles of trail wound through dense stands of golden aspen and towering ponderosa pines, their leaves creating a carpet of amber and yellow beneath Benjamin's boots. He maintained a steady pace, pausing frequently to photograph the spectacular fall colors with his digital camera. These images, he decided, would be a peace offering to Marie, a way to share the beauty that drew him to these peaks even when she couldn't join him. He sent several photos via text message, timestamps showing his progress. 10:45 a.m. at Twisted Falls Overlook, 11:30 a.m. at the rock formations known locally as Sentinel Stones. Marie was deep into her hospital shift when the messages arrived, tending to cardiac patients in the intensive care unit where she'd worked for 3 years. The photos of brilliant aspens against granite cliffs brought a smile to her face despite their recent tensions. She typed a quick response, "Gorgeous. Stay safe up there. Love you." But the message failed to deliver. Benjamin's phone had already moved beyond reliable cell coverage as he climbed toward the higher elevations. As the trail gained altitude, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Well-maintained switchbacks gave way to rocky scrambles and narrow ledges carved into the mountainside. This was exactly what Benjamin had come seeking, hiking that demanded complete mental focus, forcing all other worries from his consciousness. His breathing grew labored in the thinning air above 10,000 feet, and he stopped more frequently to rest and hydrate from his water bottles. At 12:15 p.m., he reached Eagle's Point, a dramatic granite outcropping that offered sweeping views across the valley below. The weather, however, was changing faster than morning forecasts had predicted. Wispy white clouds were thickening into an ominous grey mass moving in from the western peaks. The temperature, comfortable at 65 degrees when Benjamin started hiking, began dropping rapidly as wind picked up through the high country. He pulled on his fleece layer and checked his handheld GPS unit, noting that he was making excellent time and could afford to take the scenic route back down if conditions remained stable. But conditions were deteriorating quickly. By 1:30 p.m., the first snowflakes began falling, unusual for mid-October, but not unprecedented at this elevation in Colorado. Benjamin, experienced enough to recognize the signs of a developing mountain storm, began his descent earlier than originally planned. He retraced his steps along the narrow ridge trail, moving carefully as moisture made the granite surfaces increasingly treacherous. His GPS device showed he was still on track to reach the parking lot by his promised 4:00 p.m. return time, even accounting for weather delays. Meanwhile, Marie's 12-hour shift was ending at 3:00 p.m. She finally had a chance to check her personal phone and saw Benjamin's morning photos, the images of golden aspens and mountain vistas melting away her lingering anger from their argument. She sent another message. "Beautiful pictures. Drive carefully coming down. See you tonight." But like her earlier text, this message never reached its intended recipient. Benjamin's phone had lost all signal somewhere along the exposed ridge. As afternoon shadows lengthened and snow continued falling with increasing intensity, Benjamin pressed onward through rapidly deteriorating conditions. The well-marked trail that had been so clear in morning sunshine became increasingly difficult to follow as fresh snow obscured familiar landmarks and stone cairns. His GPS device, which had functioned perfectly all day, began displaying low battery warnings, something he hadn't anticipated when packing that morning. The sub-freezing temperatures were draining power much faster than normal, and he'd neglected to bring backup batteries. At 5 p.m., with no sign of her husband, Marie began feeling the first stirrings of genuine worry. She tried calling his cell phone repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail. The logical part of her mind insisted that Benjamin was simply running late due to weather conditions, but a growing sense of dread settled in her stomach. She'd been married to him long enough to know his methodical nature when it came to outdoor activities. If Benjamin said 4:00 p.m., he meant 4 p.m. unless something was seriously wrong. By 6 p.m., Marie was driving through increasingly heavy snowfall toward the mountains, despite dangerous road conditions. She called 911 from her cell phone while navigating the winding highway, reporting her husband overdue from a solo hike. The dispatcher followed standard protocol, explaining that they typically waited 24 hours before initiating formal search operations. However, given the severe weather moving through the area, they agreed to send a ranger to check the trailhead parking area immediately. When Marie arrived at Devil's Backbone Trail at 7:30 p.m., Benjamin's green Ford Explorer sat alone in the lot, covered with several inches of fresh snow. The sight of that familiar vehicle, isolated and abandoned looking in the storm, nearly shattered her composure completely. She sat in her own car for several long minutes, engine running and heater blasting, trying to process the reality that her husband was somewhere out there in this blizzard. The wind howled through the peaks above, and visibility was reduced to mere yards in the swirling snow. Ranger Rodriguez arrived shortly after Marie, his powerful flashlight cutting through the darkness and precipitation as he examined both the trail register and Benjamin's locked vehicle. The truck showed no signs of disturbance or forced entry. Benjamin's emergency contact information listed Marie as primary, and Rodriguez gently explained search protocols while trying to offer reassurance based on his 15 years of mountain rescue experience. Weather delays were common. Most overdue hikers turned up cold, exhausted, and embarrassed, but fundamentally unharmed within 24 hours. That night stretched endlessly for Marie as she waited in a small motel room in nearby Estes Park. She stared out the frost-covered window at continuing snowfall, imagining Benjamin huddled in some cave or beneath an overhang, waiting for conditions to improve enough for rescue teams to find him. She called his parents in Michigan and his younger brother in California, struggling to keep her voice steady while explaining the situation. Everyone offered to fly out immediately, but she asked them to wait until morning when surely the search would locate him quickly. Dawn broke clear and blindingly bright on October 16th, revealing a transformed landscape buried under 8 inches of fresh snow. The search operation began at first light, with 12 personnel, park rangers, volunteer search and rescue members from 3 counties, and 2 German Shepherd tracking dogs trained specifically for wilderness rescue. The dogs immediately picked up Benjamin's scent at the trailhead and followed it confidently for the first 3 miles, exactly matching the route indicated by his GPS timestamps from the previous day. Marie joined the search, despite gentle protests from coordinators who worried about untrained civilians in dangerous terrain. She wasn't qualified for technical rescue operations, but she understood Benjamin's habits and decision-making patterns better than anyone else. She hiked behind the main search teams, calling his name until her voice grew hoarse, scanning every snow-covered boulder and tree for any sign of his distinctive red jacket or blue day pack. As afternoon approached, the search had covered the main trail system and several branching routes without discovering any trace of Benjamin beyond his confirmed morning GPS coordinates. The tracking dogs lost his scent completely where the trail crossed an exposed granite section near Eagles Point, the same location where his final successful GPS reading had been recorded the previous day. Search Coordinator Lieutenant Karen Mills made the decision to expand the search grid significantly, calling in additional personnel and requesting helicopter support when weather conditions permitted safe flying. The search operation continued with growing intensity for 3 full days. Marie's parents drove out from Kansas to provide emotional support, while Benjamin's family arrived from various states across the country. The modest motel in Estes Park became an impromptu command center filled with topographic maps, weather reports, search grids, and the quiet desperation of people refusing to accept an unthinkable outcome. Local churches organized meal trains for the families, and the small mountain community rallied around the search effort with remarkable generosity. Regional media outlets picked up the story by the 3rd day, broadcasting features about the missing Denver software engineer and the massive search operation involving over 40 trained personnel. Benjamin's photograph, a professional headshot from his company website showing his friendly smile and wire-rimmed glasses, appeared on evening news programs throughout Colorado and neighboring states. Tips and reported sightings poured in from across the Rocky Mountain region, each one thoroughly investigated despite their increasingly improbable nature. On the 4th day, as the official search operation began winding down according to standard protocols, Marie made a decision that would financially devastate their family for years to come. Against the strong advice of search coordinators and her own family members, she hired a private search company to continue looking for Benjamin using specialized equipment and techniques. The cost was enormous, nearly $30,000 that they couldn't afford, but she couldn't bear the thought of abandoning her husband to the wilderness. Professional searchers spent 2 additional weeks combing increasingly remote and dangerous areas of the mountain wilderness, utilizing ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging equipment, and high-resolution aerial photography. They found wildlife tracks, abandoned camping gear from previous seasons, and weather-worn debris scattered by decades of storms, but nothing connected to Benjamin Scott. The private search company eventually recommended suspending operations, having exhausted all reasonable possibilities within their capabilities and budget constraints. The weeks following Benjamin's disappearance blurred together in a haze of police interviews, insurance paperwork, and well-meaning visitors who struggled to find appropriate words for such an unprecedented situation. Marie took extended leave from her nursing position, unable to concentrate on patient care while her own world remained completely shattered. She spent countless hours researching missing person cases online, learning about wilderness survival techniques, and studying other disappearances in Colorado's mountain regions. The internet became both her lifeline and her torture device, offering endless possibilities and theories, but never providing the concrete answers she desperately needed. She joined online forums for families of missing persons, connecting with others who understood the unique agony of not knowing whether to grieve or hope. These virtual communities provided support that well-meaning friends and family members simply couldn't offer, having never experienced the particular hell of loving someone who had simply vanished. Benjamin's parents, George and Linda Scott, struggled with their own overwhelming grief while trying to support their daughter-in-law through the crisis. George, a retired mechanical engineer who shared his son's analytical mindset, threw himself into studying the search data with obsessive detail. He created elaborate spreadsheets tracking every area explored, every piece of evidence considered, every theory proposed by investigators. Linda, a recently retired elementary school teacher, focused her energy on maintaining hope and organizing continued search efforts through their Michigan church community. When spring arrived early in 2004, melting the snow and revealing the landscape where Benjamin had vanished, Marie organized volunteer search parties almost every weekend. Groups of friends, co-workers, church members, and complete strangers touched by the story spent their Saturdays hiking off-trail routes and exploring remote canyons that the official search might have overlooked. Each expedition yielded nothing but physical exhaustion and growing emotional despair, but Marie couldn't stop trying. The one-year anniversary of Benjamin's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from the public. Marie appeared on several regional television programs, carefully composing herself for cameras while pleading for any information that might provide closure. She'd learned to speak in the concise soundbites that television required, conveying both hope and urgency in 30-second segments. Privately, however, she was beginning to accept what everyone else had concluded months earlier. Benjamin was never coming home. Detective Ray Hoffman, the missing persons investigator assigned to coordinate the case, maintained regular contact with Marie throughout the second year of Benjamin's disappearance. A 23-year veteran of the Colorado State Patrol, Hoffman had worked dozens of missing hiker cases during his career. Most concluded within days, either with successful rescue or recovery of remains. Cases like Benjamin's, where experienced hikers simply vanished without leaving any trace, were the most challenging for everyone involved. "These mountains usually don't keep secrets this well," Hoffman explained to Marie during one of their periodic meetings at the State Patrol office. "We've had cases where remains were discovered decades later, revealed by rock slides or erosion, but we've covered every logical search area multiple times with the best available technology. If he's up there somewhere, he's in a location that none of us thought to examine." Marie began attending weekly meetings of a support group for families of missing persons, gathering with others who lived in the same terrible limbo between hope and acceptance. There was Janet, whose 17-year-old daughter had disappeared from a shopping mall parking lot 15 years earlier, and Robert, whose adult son had vanished while rock climbing in Utah's desert canyons. Their stories shared disturbing common elements: the initial frantic searching, the gradual acceptance of official limitations, the way grief evolved when there was no body to bury and no definitive endpoint for mourning. Time moved strangely for Marie. During those years following Benjamin's disappearance, seasons changed around her, friends got married and divorced, the world continued evolving, while she remained emotionally frozen in October 2003. She eventually returned to her nursing position at Denver General, finding unexpected solace in helping other families navigate medical crises and uncertainty. Her patients often commented on her unusual empathy for relatives facing ambiguous situations, though they never learned the source of her deep understanding. Benjamin's case file remained officially open, but practically inactive, as new missing person cases demanded Detective Hoffman's attention and resources. The trail, such as it had ever existed, had long grown completely cold. Marie understood this reality intellectually, but emotionally she felt abandoned by the system that had promised to keep searching. She continued conducting her own investigations, corresponding with families of other missing hikers and researching similar cases throughout the western United States. In 2008, 5 years after Benjamin's disappearance, Marie made the agonizing decision to petition the court for a declaration of death in absentia. The legal process felt like an ultimate betrayal of the man she'd loved. But financial realities made it necessary for survival. Insurance benefits, retirement account access, and the ability to settle their joint affairs couldn't wait indefinitely for closure that might never arrive. She kept all of Benjamin's belongings exactly as he'd left them, but began the slow, painful process of rebuilding her identity as a widow rather than a wife waiting for her husband's impossible return. The declaration of death brought unexpected psychological relief, along with renewed waves of grief that caught Marie completely off guard. She began dating again tentatively in 2010, 7 years after Benjamin's disappearance, meeting David Chen through their mutual work at the hospital. David was a respiratory therapist who understood the medical world's demands and respected the complexity of Marie's situation. Their relationship developed slowly over months of coffee conversations and careful emotional navigation as David learned to love someone who might never be entirely free from her past. Marie and David married in a small ceremony in 2012, surrounded by close friends and family who had supported them both through the long journey toward healing. She wore a new wedding ring on her left hand, but couldn't bring herself to remove Benjamin's gold band from her right ring finger. Their honeymoon was a hiking trip through Montana's Glacier National Park, Marie's first time on mountain trails since Benjamin's disappearance 9 years earlier. Standing on a windswept peak with her new husband, she finally allowed herself to cry for everything she'd lost and everything she'd unexpectedly found. The years that followed brought a kind of peace that Marie had never expected to achieve after such devastating loss. She and David purchased a house together in a Denver suburb, carefully blending their lives while making space for the complicated grief that would always be part of Marie's story. They discussed having children, but never actively pursued pregnancy, both understanding that some chambers of Marie's heart would forever belong to Benjamin's memory. David never pressured her about this. He'd fallen in love with all of Marie, including her history and her ongoing healing process. Detective Hoffman retired in 2015 after 30 years of service, but not before personally briefing his replacement on Benjamin's case and several other long-term missing person investigations. Officer Sarah Martinez, young and eager to prove herself in the detective division, reviewed the thick file thoroughly and promised Marie that new techniques and advancing technologies would be applied as they became available. DNA databases were expanding rapidly, satellite imagery was improving dramatically, and cold case units across the country were solving decades-old mysteries with increasing frequency. Marie had learned to carry hope differently by that point, not as the desperate, consuming force that had nearly destroyed her in those first years, but as a quiet possibility that could coexist peacefully with acceptance and moving forward. She visited Devil's Backbone Trail every October 15th, hiking the first few miles where Benjamin's presence had been definitively confirmed. These weren't search missions anymore, but remembrance walks, opportunities to feel spiritually close to the man who had fundamentally shaped her understanding of both love and loss. 20 years after Benjamin Scott walked into the Colorado wilderness and never returned, a group of graduate geology students from the University of Colorado made a discovery that would resurrect a case everyone assumed was permanently closed. The students were conducting field research on erosion patterns in remote areas of the national forest, documenting how climate change and increasingly severe weather events were dramatically altering the mountain landscape. Their professor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had deliberately chosen some of the most inaccessible canyon systems specifically because they had received minimal scientific study. Working in a narrow gorge nearly 5 miles from the main Devil's Backbone Trail system, the research team was measuring water damage from recent flash floods when graduate student Marcus Thompson spotted something obviously artificial wedged tightly between two massive granite boulders. He carefully extracted what appeared to be a hiking boot, severely weathered and partially buried under decades of debris, but still recognizably manufactured rather than natural. The sole displayed a distinctive tread pattern, and inside the tongue, faded but still legible, were the initials BS written in black permanent marker. Dr. Walsh immediately contacted park authorities, who secured the discovery site and called in the Colorado State Patrol. Detective Sergeant Martinez, now with 12 years of experience handling missing person cases, responded personally to the scene. She had reviewed Benjamin Scott's file multiple times over the years and knew from witness statements that he had been wearing Merrell hiking boots the day he disappeared, boots that his wife had helped him mark with his initials after a previous mix-up at their local climbing gym. The location where the boot was discovered proved startling to everyone familiar with the original 2003 search operation. The narrow canyon required technical climbing skills to access safely and was nearly a mile from any established trail system. More puzzling still was the fact that extensive ground searches had covered this general area, though perhaps not this specific canyon system, which would have been considered too remote and dangerous for a day hiker to reach accidentally. Marie received the phone call while working her afternoon shift in the cardiac intensive care unit at Denver General Hospital. Sergeant Martinez's voice was carefully controlled as she explained the discovery, emphasizing that finding one boot didn't necessarily mean they had found Benjamin's remains, but it represented the first concrete evidence in 20 years. Marie's hands trembled as she requested immediate permission to leave work, her mind racing through possibilities she had trained herself to stop contemplating years earlier. The gathering at the discovery site felt surreal to everyone involved. Marie, now 52 and accompanied by her supportive husband David, stood at the rim of the canyon, where Benjamin's boot had been found wedged between boulders. The terrain was far more rugged and technical than anything along the main trail system, and she struggled to imagine how her husband could have ended up in such a remote, dangerous location. Search Coordinator Mills, now retired but consulting on the case, admitted that this area had been considered too unlikely to warrant the intensive searching devoted to other regions. 20 years of severe weather, flash flooding and rock slides could have carried that boot a considerable distance from its original location, Mills explained to the assembled team of investigators and family members. We absolutely cannot assume that Benjamin was ever actually in this specific canyon. But this is our first real clue in 2 decades, and we're going to follow wherever it leads us. The renewed search effort was smaller in scale, but far more technologically sophisticated than the original 2003 operation. Ground-penetrating radar equipment, thermal imaging drones, and advanced GPS mapping systems were employed to examine every accessible inch of the canyon system and surrounding drainage areas. Volunteer rock climbers rappelled into areas that couldn't be reached safely on foot, and the search grid was expanded to include water flow patterns that might have carried debris from much higher elevations over the course of 2 decades. Marie found herself reliving the emotional intensity of those first desperate weeks, but now with the perspective that 20 years of healing and personal growth had provided. She was no longer the frantic young wife who had slept in her car at the trailhead. She had evolved into a mature woman who had learned to carry grief without being completely crushed by its weight. David's steady, supportive presence helped her navigate the renewed media attention and the complex emotions that arose from having long dormant hope suddenly rekindled. The intensive search operation continued for 2 full weeks without uncovering any additional evidence related to Benjamin's disappearance. Forensic experts examined the recovered boot extensively, confirming through DNA analysis that it had indeed belonged to Benjamin Scott. The leather and synthetic materials had preserved remarkably well in Colorado's dry mountain environment, protected by the boulder crevice where it had remained wedged for potentially decades. Despite the most thorough investigation this remote area had ever received, no other trace of Benjamin was discovered. Dr. Walsh's ongoing erosion research provided crucial insights into how the boot might have traveled to its final resting place. Her team's detailed analysis suggested that a series of particularly severe flash floods between 2015 and 2018 had dramatically altered the canyon's topography, carving entirely new drainage channels and depositing debris in patterns that simply wouldn't have existed during the original search efforts. The boot could feasibly have been dislodged from a location miles away and carried downstream during these catastrophic weather events. This scientific explanation offered both a form of closure and deep frustration for everyone involved. It suggested that Benjamin's remains might have been discoverable in the years immediately following his disappearance, but that natural forces had since scattered or permanently buried any evidence. The mountains had finally yielded one carefully guarded secret, while somehow managing to keep the larger mystery completely intact. Marie chose to keep Benjamin's recovered hiking boot in a place of honor in the home she shared with David, treating it as a tangible connection to the husband she had lost so many years before. The discovery had answered some questions while raising many others, but it provided something invaluable that she had never expected to receive: concrete proof that her 20 years of wandering and searching hadn't been completely in vain. Benjamin had indeed been on that mountain, had walked in those boots, had existed in the wilderness where she had always believed he had found his final rest. The case officially remains open today, filed under death by misadventure, with the location of remains unknown and recovery unlikely. Detective Martinez continues following up on occasional tips and new technological advances, understanding that mountains sometimes reveal their secrets decades or even centuries after first hiding them. Marie has found a measure of peace with this continuing ambiguity, finally understanding that some mysteries are simply larger than human need for complete resolution and closure. On quiet October afternoons, Marie still hikes the lower sections of Devil's Backbone Trail, sometimes alone with her memories and sometimes accompanied by David's understanding presence. She carries Benjamin's recovered boot in her daypack, not as a morbid talisman, but as a powerful reminder that love persists far beyond physical presence, that searching itself can be a profound form of devotion, and that wilderness holds both devastating loss and transcendent beauty in equal measure. The mountains continue keeping their secrets, but they also preserve the evidence of lives lived fully, even when those lives end in mystery that may never be solved.